The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to this NHS Clinical Commissioners and NHS webinar. My name is Julie Wood. I'm Chief Executive of NHS Clinical Commissioners, and I'm going to be chairing today's webinar, which is about the National Review of the Quality and Outcomes Framework. I'm joined by a number of colleagues, both here in the room in London and virtually, who are going to give a series of inputs over the next 35 minutes or so, and then we'll be able to open up the webinar for comment, discussion, questions. We are expecting an awful lot of people to join us on the webinar today, which is great news, because certainly from NHS Clinical Commissioners' perspective, we've been really keen to engage with the membership and to encourage NHS England colleagues to continue to engage with CCGs around the review of QOF. So it's pleasing that so many people have logged on today to join. What it does do is mean that it'll be interesting if all 100 of you who've logged on all want to ask questions, so we will need to manage that as we go through the next hour. So we have a series of inputs, as I've said, from a number of colleagues, but if we can just look at the aims of the webinar today, they are to, forward too many slides, that's it, thank you. The planning guidance, as the slide says, sets out the ambition for primary care networks to develop across England. And so colleagues in NHS England are looking at the incentives that exist in primary care and how they can support integrated models. So today you're going to hear more about the growing role of networks, but also hear an example about local incentive schemes that are operating across networks and across CCGs. But critically also to update you on the QOF review, where it's got to, and stakeholder feedback that has been received so far. And then colleagues from NHS England would particularly like your thoughts on a couple of issues that are particularly tricky, and I sit as a member of the QOF advisory group, and I would echo the trickiness, if I can use there is such a word, of these issues. So it's about the balance of practice-based incentives and network-based incentives, given that QOF is very much seen as core business income now, and how do you get that right and how does that work? And then the other bit is about what's the role of demand management incentives that actually do support changes in the way in which demand flows into and out of general practice, into the wider NHS, and how they can be implemented effectively. So at the end of the webinar, we will be asking a number of questions about that. So as we go through the discussion, please do think about that. Please do send in your comments and questions, and we will pick those up as we go to get towards the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is someone well known to NHS Clinical Commissioners, Dr. Nikita Kanani. Nikki is now Deputy Director of Primary Care at NHS England, still a practicing GP for a bit of the time, but formerly a Chair and Chief Clinical Officer of the CCG, and formerly an NHSCC board member, so is known very well before. So Nikki's going to talk to us about perspectives on primary care networks before we hand over to colleagues from Buckinghamshire CCG, Simon Keary, who's going to talk about their experiences of running a local scheme, and then hand back to Gabby Darby from NHS England, who's going to talk about the update of the QOF review and what you've learned so far. So Nikki, over to you.
Really, thanks, and thank you so much for having me join you today. And I know a number of you that are either on the panel or attending today from a number of previous roles. I've been at NHS England now just over 100 days, but my past life, and certainly I feel actually still very much at the core of what I do is work as a commissioner and think as a clinical commissioner. And many of you in your own commissioning geographies will feel the very real tension between trying to sustain general practice and also help general practice move to the right model of delivery, the right care model for you, for your general population within your own patch. And it's really difficult. We often talk about the early adopters and the primary care integrated care systems at one end of the spectrum, and then we have practices that are really deeply struggling on the other end of the spectrum. And I remember not so long ago, one of my real low points as a chief officer of a CCG was when a senior partner of a practice in my patch, so something I felt very responsible for, called me in tears because she just couldn't make it work. She had lost hope. She couldn't see her way through to a future that could mean she could be working as a GP in her practice. And it took a huge amount of work, both from the CCG, the LMC, the local federation, and others, to try and tie round a system of support around her. And actually, she texted me at the beginning of the week, and she was saying, you know, still tough going, but I feel like we're doing better. I feel okay now. I feel like I've got some hope. And one of the things when we were trying to explore the sorts of things we needed to do with and for general practice was, how do we make the money work? How do we make the incentives and the payment structures work? Because I don't know about you, but certainly when we were mapping the different income sources for general practice, it was often fragmented and siloed and didn't necessarily feel as though it was helping to take general practice on the sort of journey that it needed to go on. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes taking you through some of the ambitions, some of the things that we're thinking at NHS England that some of you will be aware of, and you'll know that at the beginning of this year, there was a real ground shift when we started to talk about primary care networks and the planning guidance. And it was just before I was coming into this role, and it was a really welcome move to the Commission. I hope you felt that as well in your own patches. But to do that, we need to make sure that the national kind of direction of travel is supportive and helpful as well. I think many of you will have heard this quote, and it's not just from Simon, but from many others as well. If we don't create and support a robust foundation of general practice and primary care, everything else slips apart, and you will be feeling that in different degrees in your own patches. Our view is 2 and a bit years into its journey now, and we're starting to see some green shoots of success, some areas where we're having some palpable change, some palpable signs of a difference in terms of the initiatives available, in terms of the ambition and the journey that general practice can go on. And so if we can believe that we can move forward in a way that keeps pace with that over the next few months and years towards 2020, then what we want to make sure is that we also have a focus on some of the key enablers mentioned here, so self-care, the use of technology appropriately, and we know that there's been some really disruptive technologies that we've been exposed to in the last 6-8 months, and that's something that we really do need to consider as to what we then do in the future and how we work in the future. How we work with the workforce, which is changing dramatically, and you'll be very cognizant of the fact that our workforce wants to work differently in primary care. They want to spend their weeks differently. They want to spend the bulk of their week working in different ways. And so how can we then start to stack together our offer to practices so that we can get the right outcome for our residents and for our population by working together in a more networked way. A general practice will really embed, and in some areas you can see the real impact that it's having. Then actually by the time we get to 2020, what we want to do is make sure that we can deliver care around a person through general practice with all of the assets of general practice. But where there are services that are too big to be in every practice, where it doesn't make sense to do it in every area, the development of primary care networks which allow practices particularly to focus on the population at a greater scale. And so there is a natural sort of progression, and it won't feel like this in every patch, but there is certainly some areas that will feel that you're along different parts of this journey. It'll be interesting to see if this resonates. Certainly from my perspective as a GP, I know my neighbouring practices. It works less well in rural areas, but certainly in and around some of the bigger cities, you work in groups of 5 practices delivering care for 30 to 50,000 patients, and that's the natural kind of hub of general practice going forward, and where we can get scale. Build some resilience, being able to share some of the staff, some of the resources, some of the ability to work together to scale bigger than that. And certainly in my old patch, this was the kind of the fundamental space where we started to work together for education and training. You might have taken part of in the general practice development program, which is now in about 170. So if it hasn't come to yours, please look out for it. Get in touch, let's direct the resources that are out there. Starting to think about how IT and technology can look different within your primary care network, and then starting to layer onto that. So how could you deliver potentially hub-based services, social prescribing within a patch, which really does play to the asset of delivering care for a population as opposed to just an individual set of patients with conditions, but looking much more at population health, working with our colleagues in community pharmacy. And something that's really important there, I think, in the centre is around how we build the attractiveness of general practice, because although there are lots of initiatives going on to make general practice attractive again in the future, to stop people leaving right now, we also need to look at a model of care that allows people to feel that it could be exciting again. And then as we start to lay on to that, thinking about the sorts of services we could deliver within a hub, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And when nationally we start talking about another set of acronyms, and in my previous match we used to sort of say, ignore the acronyms, so you think about what your population needs first of all. And we had an 11-year life expectancy discrepancy from the north to the south of the borough, so you couldn't deliver care directly exactly the same across the patch. But also think about what your workforce looks like, and how that workforce is going to come together, making sure that care is centred around a person, which is at the heart of this concentric set of circles, that each person has access to care within a practice, which is that core of general practice, the assets that many of us talk about, continuity, personalised care, which is at its heart accessible, but then building into geographical areas of 30 to 50,000 people. Now that isn't prescriptive, so if you come and say, look, we've got 55,000, or we've got 60,000, but actually it works because of this particular population, that makes sense. It needs to make sense for your local population, but having the data behind that to actually allow you to deliver really integrated multidisciplinary teams, and peer review, and some of the demand management initiatives that we're going to come on to, start to then scale up care. And then many of you will have emerging or even well-developed federations sitting across your patch, which actually offer more of that scale, more of that leadership support, and that boost for integration across and throughout primary care and further. And then within that, you may be part of an emerging ICS, which is a wider set of commissioners and providers. And really where it gets exciting is when you start talking about what the capitated budget could be for a population within that sort of framework. And we can talk a little. What we really want to do with the review is give practices and commissioners the opportunity to start to move along that path a bit further and a bit faster for the areas that are ready to do so. And I talk to a lot of GPs that sort of sit somewhere in the middle, so they're not the ICSs and they're not quite falling over yet, and they're saying, well, we're working together with other practices. What is there out there for us to move on to the next stage of our journey? We know we need to look and feel and work differently, but we're not quite sure how the system is going to support us to do that, and this is very much part of that. So if with the eye of faith and with a bucket full of hope, which is how I tend to work, you can see yourself towards 2020, and as commissioners, having identified your primary care networks and understood what the key enablers are within that, then actually you've got a really good footprint to develop service delivery units to offer services in a much more joined up way across a patch and through more of a hub and spoke model. Align the incentives around you, which is what this discussion is about. You can start to see a space where a person will go through their life journey and access healthcare, often to keep them well. So very much self-care, empowerment and enablement, using apps and wearable technology, understanding when and how to access care. When access to in-hours care, so that's the green box at the top, which might be virtual, might be face-to-face, it might be with you as a GP, you as a nurse, it might be with your practice care navigator. Out of hours or any hours, unwell, being able to access care remotely or face-to-face, over through your community pharmacy, your access hub, your extended hours GP practice. But it's the hub in the middle that's really exciting, because actually what we're starting to develop now is the first contact physio offer. You would have heard in the news over the last couple of days the mental health therapy offer in practices and within primary care networks. Some of you will be familiar with the frustrations of, or maybe GPs coming to you, or GPs yourself, sort of seeing somebody with a minor eye condition and having to refer back to optometry, or somebody being seen in general optician services and having to be seen by you in order to be referred on to ophthalmology. So much more support in the community for people to be seen naturally in the community. Frailty teams. So if you've got an frailty index in your GMS contract, actually, you know, what you then do with that is you have the opportunity to link through a community frailty team, which is for your primary care network, and working much more imaginatively with the third sector, with social prescribing services, to make sure that we have much better access to the right services for our residents. So that's the sort of kind of development of services. And one of the things that as commissioners you'll hear a lot of, and we, you know, in my previous role and in this role, I think do need to feel pressure is the number of people who are being guided through the system to the GP, as in the general practitioner, as opposed to the wider practice team, often not necessarily appropriately, and that's not because the patient is trying to inappropriately access that care, but the systems that we have in place sort of direct people there almost inadvertently to do spaces where people will make well-intentioned and well-informed choices, focusing on self with the suite of online and remote offers that are available. We get directed to the right place initially, so that might be through care navigation or health champions working in a hub-type model, making sure that people have access to social prescribing, the critical role of community pharmacy within this, and the direct access services systems. Moving on to new consultation models through the high impact changes in the GP development programs, so making sure that people have the appropriate access to telephone triage and online triage as well. And then making sure that practices, either each practice or practices in the hub-based offer, have access to, again, clinical pharmacists, which many of you will have embraced and really found the benefit of, mental health therapists, and that really brilliantly highly skilled set of an advanced nurse practitioner within a practice or within a hub. And then you start to rebalance the pressures within general practice, making right people end up seeing the GP with the support of the specialist, enhanced guidance consult and enhanced guidance and advice, and out into the community and into the hub where that's appropriate to do so. And so that starts to build starting with the general practice strategy, which is a couple of years in, but actually now saying, well, what if we can embed everything that we've aspired to in the general practice review, then with an eye of faith, what can we do from 2020 and onwards? And that, I suppose, is what I want you to hold.
Thank you, Nikki.
In your mind
sorry to interrupt you again. We're running very short of time, because I know we've got a lot to get through. So thank you for that. It's really helpful explanation about where we're going and where the conversations about networks are. We're now going to hand over to Buckinghamshire CCG, to colleagues Simon Keary and Helen Datra, who are going to talk us through their experience of working with a local quality scheme. Can I ask you to just speed up as much as you can, but so that we can get the third bit of the presentations in before we close off the webinar for discussion. So over to you, Simon and Helen.
Okay, so welcome and good afternoon. My name is Simon Keary. I'm head of localities for NHS Buckinghamshire CCG. Just going to go through a bit of background to the scheme, where it came from, little about what we've learned in year one, that was last year, 17-18, some of the feedback we had from our and how they felt it was going, and then what plans have we got for year two, which is 18-19, the one we're in at the moment, and then potentially next steps, which might hark back to some of the presentation we just heard from Nikki. Buckinghamshire County, 528,000 population. I think the key element on this is really that we are part of the ICS Pathfinder group, one of 8 in England to do that. And we've got one GP federation which covers the patch. Why move towards QOF? Well, effectively, our Aylesbury practices wanted to do some development work and innovation about 2 years ago. And the care and support planning that they were planning to do around diabetes, COPD and dementia meant that they wouldn't actually have ticked some of the boxes at the current QOF scheme. So in conversation with NHS England, there was an agreement that they would potentially have what's known as QOF leniency. That their QOF achievement was based on 16-17, and it then drove payments forward. Also, that we wanted to add in some of the improvement scheme that we're already running as part of the CCG investment into what practices we're doing on the ground. Just a little bit about the scheme. The scheme's made up of 4 key areas. The first part is really a foundation gateway. We required all practices to do this, and we had a number of practices that were not EMIS based. One of the things in terms of the direction of travel for this county was we wanted every practice to be based around EMIS platform, mainly because we're developing clinical services in our community around that platform as well. The other key part, which again harks to where Nikki was talking around, was in those days we talked about GP clusters, but we're now talking about networks. Potentially, can we get our practices to work more closely together as part of those networks? And that was really key. So that was the foundation gateway. We had 3 other elements. Care delivery were areas of care that practices may already be delivering, but require further focus. So some of those areas are around dementia and also some of adherence to clinical pathways. Care delivery plus were areas of care that practices may already be delivering, but required significant continued effort. I think the most obvious one was around end of life, which required many of our practices to complete advanced care plans and put those on the summary care record, and that was really key as part of that. And lastly, and this was the most exciting and innovative piece, the care delivery alternative. This part of the scheme allows alternative metrics to those mandated in traditional QOF to be delivered. So these elements were outside of QOF requirements. These metrics are those considered to demonstrate improved patient outcomes of care. In fact, there was a great deal of thought around a lot of this scheme, around actually what evidence was there around the country in terms of some of these elements making an impact on patient outcomes. I think it's quite interesting to look at the finances. Clearly, the Gateway Foundation payments on sign up to the scheme, I'm very pleased to say that we had 100% sign up from all practices across the county. They received a 50% upfront payment, and then on completion, on engagement with the scheme, a 50% back-end payment at the end of the year. We allowed CQRS to continue providing automatic aspiration payments based on their 16-17 QOF achievement, and that's been flowing through the year to practices. We then had 2 final payments made to practices. One was the final balancing CQRS payment, which was automatically calculated by that system, but also then the CCG ensured that practices received their total investment at the end of the scheme based on what we agreed with those practices up front. So that included the investment payment from CCG. So I talked about 100% sign up. All but 2 practices moved to EMIS. We're very pleased about that, and the final 2 practices are making certainly noises about going in that direction as well. The reason I said experience clearly tells was that we had a number of practices already doing some of the elements of the scheme, especially the Aylesbury practices in care and support planning, but we did have 10 practices who were part of a pilot around heart failure monitoring as well. And what we've seen, obviously, in year 1 of the scheme is those practices were already doing some of these elements, just motored on. They were really achieving on all counts. Clearly, we've used year 1 as a bit of a catch-up for many of the other practices to get on board. Lastly, CQC interest. I provided CQC with a presentation, and they came and visited us and learnt about the scheme. And what was pleasing to note, that at a recent CQC visit, practice actually fed back that they said actually they had a good conversation with CQC about this scheme. They didn't worry too much about the fact that they weren't now part of QOF, but effectively were doing our primary care development scheme. And CQC were very pleased with some of the results that was coming from the scheme. So that's really something to note, I think. One key aspect, and I'll talk about practice feedback in a moment, was the dashboard that we provided on a monthly basis. This is just an example. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, we highlighted at a recent protected learning time presentation to all practices. Those practices we were really pleased about, who'd not achieved the highest, but actually had done the most development over the year. So Berryfields was just one of our practices that had seen a fantastic increase in those patients risk scored around the CHANFAS scheme. One of the other things that the dashboard provided us was a comprehensive dashboard for each practice, which we then used as part of practice visits to then talk about how they were getting on with the scheme, the various elements of the scheme. And actually, this was all the data on here was provided on a monthly basis, so there were no surprises to those practices. We provided spark lines, we indicated areas where we thought they were not achieving as well as some of the others in their locality, in the CCG. And we also used the dashboard as part of our locality conversations to share best practice between our various practices in the various localities that we have across Buckinghamshire. ERS we were particularly proud of. We were a very low achiever as a county about a year ago, thanks to highlighting the scheme. And I think what the feedback from this practice was that effectively, as they saw things that were not working on the dashboard, they then rallied to address those areas. So providing some visibility to the performance of practice was key to this scheme. So let's have a look at the feedback. The dashboard, as I say, was extremely useful in providing practice, especially in the early part of the scheme, because there was a whole multitude of various read codes that practice was using across the piece. And this helped to standardise those, better use of the templates and searches that they were all doing on the EMIS system. We engaged with QOF masters to provide some of the templates, and their templates proved very useful. And the approach we used was that actually we weren't going to penalise practices who didn't quite make targets. What we had said to practices that we're actually look at engagement. So if you engage and you try your best as part of this scheme, you will still be rewarded as part of the scheme. And I think that was a really key message. So a high trust environment as part of this scheme. What practices said they wanted to see developed for year two were, in year one, we had a range of different templates for each element of the scheme. They wanted to see that into one single template. I think we've ended up with 2 templates, but that's a far better place than we were in year one. They wanted the searches and templates to be checked out advanced, and we worked closely with practice managers and practices to check that that's working. Also, and I'll talk about that in a moment, outcomes monitoring, that was really key. This had to be a scheme that delivered better outcomes to patients. As I say, the evidence was there to say that these elements were going to deliver those outcomes. We wanted to check how the outcomes were coming along as well. And then lastly, we talked about using the dashboard with practices as well as localities, as well as at our general CCG-wide discussions, and now part of the ICS. And last but no means least, whilst many of the practices had done very well in year one, there were still some that were struggling with certain elements of the scheme, and so we considered that we'd just leave some of the changes to year two to sort of minimum levels, mainly so practices could really get up to speed. Talking about year two changes, so we're now part of the ICS, so we've built in the requirements around integrated care systems into our foundation. So that's really important. We've dropped the EMIS requirement because practices have developed that. And the ERS target, as all will know on the call, that's now mandatory from October 2018. So there's no requirement special to that. Small changes on individual elements. So we've cut down the right care pathways that we were looking at to those which included secondary care services and triage services across the piece. We've expanded care and support planning. There were a number of practices who were doing fantastic well in terms of care and support planning, and we wanted to encourage them to use that for other long-term conditions, as say chronic vascular disease, COPD, dementia, etc. We've been monitoring all that across the piece. And lastly, we've expanded our prescribing element to include non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug monitoring as part of our increased development of that side of things. How we see next steps happening? Well, as I said, we're going to increase our monitoring of the outcomes and really look at what impact this scheme is making on our patients. That's really key for us. Close monitoring of achievements. We've expanded the dashboard. We want to see that being used on a more regular basis across the piece. And as I said, we've got some practices who are doing really well, but we want to further support those practices who are struggling, perhaps in year one, with more development. We've got a comprehensive education scheme around a number of elements on this scheme, and to bring those practices up to where the rest of those practices are. And really, I'm going to hark back to some of the things that Nikki said. So there are going to be major impacts on our thinking around this scheme in 1920 as practices develop care networks, as we find we have more integrated services across the piece. Who actually does some of this work will be up for debate. And also then there's the, which is very pertinent to the discussion, about where does QOF go from this year. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks very much, Simon. And so we'll swiftly move on before taking questions on all three presentations, and hand over now to Gabby Darby, who's going to update us on QOF review and what colleagues have heard so far.
Thanks very much, Julie. So just by way of brief introduction, I lead a policy unit within NHS England, and we are thinking about the design of primary care incentives in future. So there are two big components to that. So one is what we do in terms of national incentives, and I'll give you an update on the QOF review. And then the other is what's done in terms of local incentives, which from the work we've done, we're aware makes up a significant proportion of practice income, and so has quite a big impact on where they'll prioritise. So if we're online with slides, brilliant. So if you could just flick on a slide, then you can see an overview of the methodology for the review. Now, it's worth saying that as part of this review, some of the evidence that we've considered as we understand the impact of current QOF is we've looked at the CCGs where they've undertaken local variations. I think you'll be aware that what we've asked is during the course of the review, and whilst we're evaluating those existing variations, that other CCGs who are looking to perhaps move away from QOF, rather than designing something locally, feed into this national process. Because it's one of the reflections from sites who've done this is it's time consuming to design those local variations. And we think it might be possible to do something kind of more efficient by working together, given that CCGs have such common aims, but perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion at the end. Sorry, if we just go back to the methodologies just to talk this through, we've had four main questions. So understanding the impact of current QOF, understanding the context in future direction, which includes everything that Nikki was saying earlier on, and then combining that into a number of different ideas or scenarios for how things could therefore work differently in future. And what we're doing now is testing a few of those ideas with a range of stakeholders, practice staff, patients, national charities, and yourselves, and that will inform whatever becomes a final proposal with the help of our advisory group that includes Julie and NHSCC, and that will ultimately all input into negotiations between NHS England and BMA. So no decisions made as yet, but really helpful to have your reflections on where this should be going. Next slide then. I think I've covered that in terms of the groups that we've been engaging with. So here are the highlights from what we've heard from those groups when we did a round of engagement around Christmas. So lots of this will be familiar. From patients in particular, we asked them what was the biggest priority for them and what they want from their general practice. And they talked about continuity of care. They were supportive of practice networking so long as it wasn't about sacrificing that continuity of care and ending up seeing more different people, but they were very supportive of the idea that it might be a helpful way to access a wider range of services. Lots of interest in support to self-care and person-centeredness. And I think this is important when we're thinking about QoF, where there are specific indicator thresholds that at the moment apply pretty broadly to the whole population. One of the things that we've been thinking about is actually how can we create some more space to tailor care and to target care towards individuals according to their needs rather than on a one-size-fits-all model. And finally, they were reflecting on access, that it's variable and actually it would be more appropriate if patient appointments and kind of method suited to the need of that patient. So it could be something quick and digital, or it could be that it needs a half-an-hour appointment for a more complex appointment. We then also spoke to general practice staff. So we can click on to the next slide for the highlights from them. And then they had a much more specific sort of reflections on their experience of QoF rather than what we heard from patients, which was a more general set of priorities. So you won't be surprised to hear that one of the points that has come through consistently in the review is that although when QoF was first introduced there was additional investment, since then this has become core income for practices. It funds practice teams. It's had a big impact on the makeup of practice teams and increased the nursing workforce. And it could destabilise those practice teams if there was a big change in QoF income. So we need to be we've been very conscious of stability. Structure. So one of the real positives is that it's facilitated much greater use of and consistent use of clinical systems, and the prompts within those systems are useful and have led to more consistent care for patients with long-term conditions. There was a particularly big impact when QoF was first introduced on bringing up to a consistent standard long-term condition care. And it's also that use of IT has generated useful data for health planning, which is used by lots of different organisations, Public Health England, charity groups, and academics for multiple studies, which have been really helpful. It's allowed better planning. The use of registers and things has allowed better planning for populations. And we know that that's an important part of what we want to do more of as we move towards more integrated and proactive care systems. But QoF doesn't reflect the complexity of patient needs. It's based on single conditions. A lot of the trials that sit behind the indicators are based on less complex patients, and then GPs have to use their judgment on whether it's applicable to the patient in front of them. And one of the methods that they have to do that is use of exception reporting, but there's very negative branding around exception reporting. There's a feeling amongst GPs that if they use it, they'll be suspected for having misused it. And commissioners look to that data to inform whether care seems appropriate, but actually it's difficult to tell from the data that you get whether those exceptions have been appropriate or not. We tested the idea of running incentives across a primary care network rather than an individual practice. And the feeling was that that would need some careful thought, but we know that there are multiple CCGs that are trying this out at the moment. The big concern would be related to the point that the money they receive now is core income, so that becoming dependent on a neighbouring practice would feel like a big risk to take. And we need a broader approach to quality improvement, so the process of kind of distilling a nice guideline into an indicator means that you end up focusing on a few very specific things, and actually there are there are features of care like the coordination of that care, personalisation, looking at the whole patient, that are difficult to put an indicator to and therefore haven't been as prioritised within QOF, and that's perhaps not appropriate. So, what we heard from commissioners. And it's worth bearing in mind that a number of the commissioners were GPs in their own right. So there's some consistency of what they said and what the practices said. In addition, they mentioned the role of CCG-led schemes, which vary a lot between different areas, and that it's often more of a struggle to collect and use the data from QOF than it should be. I think those are the main things that came through, in addition to the points that came through from practice. So I'll keep going through this. On the next slide, it's just to highlight that we then did some more detailed interviews with a few CCGs who we know have some quite interesting schemes running that operate at a network level, and you may have seen some of the surveys that related to this that NHSCC kind of shared. We asked about how those network-based schemes worked in practice, what kinds of things they were incentivising, and what the challenges of implementing those were. On the next slide, which I won't spend lots of time on, you can just see the highlights of what we learned from them. Okay. And they highlighted a couple of different focuses. So one is where networks were less mature, that those schemes were very much about building the maturity of the network, shared governance, sort of some of the structural components, but not so much about the outcomes of what that network was then delivering. On the other end of the spectrum, where there were mature networks in place, there were a number of schemes that focused on the end outcome in terms of utilisation of different aspects of secondary care, outpatient referrals, and emergency admissions and prescribing in particular. And with payment for those things allocated in the network level. And those have generally not been running for a huge amount of time, but CCGs were seeing some positive results. There was a bit of concern around whether savings from that would plateau over time, and therefore whether this was would be a stable income stream, or would be a way of getting some investment to accelerate the pace of kind of growth of maturity of the network itself, but then it would plateau, which we'll see better over time. And areas felt pretty confident that ethical concerns were managed, even though this is a concern that's very often cited around any incentives around demand management. And they were confident of that because generally reward was allocated at a network level and so couldn't be converted into direct profit. And there were controls in place to validate the clinical appropriateness of the reduction in activity associated with the payment. So, what I'll do now is just frame a few questions, because there are things that we would really appreciate hearing from you around how schemes are operating locally, and leave you to ponder these in addition to asking any questions about the three presentations that we've shared with you. So the first, we'd love to hear whether your area is implementing incentives for networks rather than individual practices, and the sorts of objectives that you're incentivising networks to achieve. How you would describe the maturity level of those networks, and whether they have shared capabilities or are starting to share services at a network level, or whether it's a much earlier stage than that. Whether you would consider implementing a shared savings schemes, or in fact already have done, and whether you think we've captured here the key opportunities or risks, or what else you see there, and what support you'd like for national policymakers to facilitate the development of your incentives locally.
Thank you, Gabby. Julie Wood has just had to step out of the room. So I'm Julie Thompson. I'm the Head of Policy and Delivery. And so I'll just be finishing off the webinar with the opportunity for delegates to ask questions. while everyone's sort of thinking through what they might ask, please do use the chat box to ask your question, and we'll do our best to try and ask that to our speakers today. Gabby, would you be able to just highlight what some of the timelines are in terms of the review, so that our members can understand what we're working up to in effect?
So the review, as I mentioned, will feed into the annual negotiations between NHS and BMA, which will start in the summer and generally conclude around the autumn time. So at the moment, we're going through a round of engagement with practice staff and patients. And alongside this webinar and event with national charities, we're looking to get as much input as we can to inform a final sort of report from the advisory group, which will probably meet for the last time towards the end of this month or early June.
Thank you. We'll just have a look to see if there's any. So one of the things we are keen on understanding from you is what examples you have locally of incentive schemes, what sort of objectives you set. We're getting some questions in, that's great. How mature some of your schemes are. The point was made about whether you're implementing shared saving schemes, and also, I mean, certainly from an NHSCC point of view, what national support would be helpful to you at a local level? Okay, so we've got our first question in. Okay, so first one is, so across NCL, we're looking to develop an enhanced service offer that will be outcome-based and linked to outcomes paid for across networks. This approach has already been offered for the last year in Camden CCG. And by the way, NCL is North Central London. Do we, so that was just a point actually that was made. Another question that's come in, do we have ongoing, yeah, so everyone, the slides will be available after the webinar. Okay, excellent. Okay, so some of you are still typing. Yeah, sorry.
Simon here from Buckinghamshire. Yeah. I just was listening to what Gabby was saying. I completely agree. There were a couple of things I didn't say that we had to really think hard about in terms of our scheme. One was that because we used 16-17 as a baseline, those practices who didn't do that well in 16-17, we had to really try and smooth out their performance. That was really quite a key one for us. The other one was that effectively we were lucky in Buckinghamshire. We have quite high achieving practices that were getting 95%, 96%. So effectively opting out of QOF meant that potentially that achievement was still maintained. We still asked them to maintain their disease registers, and that was key. So you can't, at the moment, we felt that you couldn't literally cut all links to QOF, and I think that's a really important thing. What I did like about what Gabby was saying was incentivising networks. We had, as part of our foundation, a requirement for practices to work together. But I think if we can find a suitable mechanism, I'd like to hear from Gabby about some thoughts around that. It'd be great to find mechanisms where we can incentivise those networks to move forward.
So I think that, you know, the balance that we've been debating is, to what extent do you put in process-based incentives that say your network is now doing X, Y, and Z, versus how far can you kind of stretch or frame an incentive which is around the outcome, and therefore actually the work around, you know, the working together, the peer review has to be happening in the background. And I think there's a bit of a balance, because what we really want is to incentivise. So one of the great strengths of QOF is it said, this is what you need to have delivered, do it how you want. And we want to kind of take that lesson forward. So it wants to be, this is what we're looking for from the network, actually organise that how you want. I think, though, that where places have less mature networks, there does need to be a bit of support to get them to a kind of point of working together sufficiently that they have a realistic stab at achieving some of those future outcomes. So what we hear from GPC and from our other reference groups is that locally, in general, CCGs are investing in development of the network. So the kind of, you need to be doing more of X, Y, and Z, you need to be talking to each other and facilitating that and supporting some of the project management behind that. So from a national perspective, I think what we'd be looking to do is saying, well, this is what that network should now be achieving. And whether that's a matter of delivering better diabetes care across a group, or improving demand management, or improving discharge, I think there's a bit more debate to be had around what the biggest opportunities are, but we've looked to focus on the outcomes, and therefore for there to be a kind of incentive, an intrinsic incentive within that to improve the way that you're working and delivering together as a network.
Okay, that's useful, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a few more questions coming in now. Just a point being made here. So we would welcome support through national contracts to incentivise some payments via network. And a question that's come in, how have mergers been dealt with as 16-17, in 16-17, has been used as a baseline? So that's a very shorthand question. Simon, sorry,
yeah.
Read that out again. Yeah. So how have mergers been dealt with?
Oh God, goodness me!
Right.
It's a really good question. I mean, effectively, mergers in terms of the performance of the various elements of the scheme have just been taken into stride. So, yes, it might mean that potentially over the piece, the combined merged practices will deliver a lower percentage in any of the elements. However, because we didn't hard code financial reward to target achievement, that was accepted as being okay, and practices were happy to continue in that vein. The only thing it has impacted is clearly, obviously, we paid the gateway payments for each practice, and if you're merged prior to the beginning of the year, then you'd only get one of the gateway payments, because that was really on a practice basis. But I think, to some extent, I think the flexibility of the scheme enabled mergers to still not be lose out as part of the scheme.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got an example here. So we have a local incentive scheme called ACE. Practices are paid to engage with each other as localities, and also to engage with CCG meetings such as the AGM. We're funded to train staff to deliver such things as phlebotomy, diabetes, injectables, initiation, spirometry, and ECGs, either in practice in the practice of to each other, and to pay for those if they refer another practice within the locality. Finally, there is an enhanced clinical section, COPD, diabetes, end of life, over and above what they deliver via QOF. It's the third year now, and the localities are well embedded thanks to the ACE scheme and the enablers being delivered within primary care. So if it's all right, I might just say things up.
That's quite an interesting example of some of those, because what that's doing is combining potentially what we had as part of our scheme with also some of our local direct awards elements, and that has been a conversation we've had here in Buckinghamshire about whether we merge in some of our direct awards management with the actual development scheme that we've got as part of QOF. We've kept them separate for the moment.
Excellent. So this is great. Some really good examples coming through. We've got another one here. So within West Cheshire CCG, we've already developed a local enhanced service called the Primary Care Sequin. Although funding is incentivised at practice level, particularly new funding investment is available at cluster level, with practices needing to work in clusters or care communities to achieve patient outcomes. And this has been in place for some 4 years. Some practices have pooled this funding on a cluster footprint and delivered services on a wider population area. e.g. early visiting services. The CCG and some practices are now keen to deliver something similar on the basis of outcomes across the wider footprint for a QOF alternative. However, this is not universally accepted. Are there areas that have taken a mixed approach to alternative QOF sign-up dependent upon practice engagement? Also, in some Scottish contracts have incentivised cluster working. Is this likely next step for England and Wales? Okay, so that's sort of a question to Gabby and Nikki, I think, to make sense. But anyway, I'll let you go, Gabby.
So we've been looking quite closely at what they've done in Scotland, and in fact Wales do have a component now of their QOF which operates across a cluster rather than individual practice level. Scotland is interesting, so they've been the most radical. So prior to us starting this review in England, Scotland basically abolished QOF, and rather than a kind of indicator-based quality improvement mechanism, they asked all of their practices to work together in clusters with allocated practice quality improvement leads who would feed into cluster level quality improvement leads, and use a kind of peer-based sharing of best practice system. There aren't a lot of the evaluation there is still underway. So there's some results from a pilot in Inverclyde that went slightly ahead of the rest of Scotland, where their main reflections were it's taken a lot of support in terms of the data, provision of data to enable that quality improvement lead role to function well across the cluster, and that it's taken a long time to get GPs all talking to each other in those clusters, which I think is what you would expect. One of the reasons that I think we won't have quite such a radical approach in England is we've been looking quite closely at what happens when indicators are retired. And the evidence is that certainly reporting of the associated activity drops. And then you can have a debate about whether it's just the reported activity or whether it's the underlying performance as well. And we've commissioned some work from Manchester University to help us answer this question. And we think it's reasonable, based on the evidence, to expect that when you retire an indicator, the performance drops reasonably significantly, say 10–20%. And for that reason, we think there are some parts of QOF that actually it would be high risk to retire outright in the way that Scotland did. So I don't think we will copy them quite the degree of radical approach that they have taken. But if you look at Wales, they've done something a little bit less radical anyway. So they said there's still a large component of QOF which operates at practice level, but there's also a component which I think is worth about a third, which is around how practices in clusters work together to deliver certain components of pathway redesign and improvements together. And that feels like a more sort of measured approach that we could learn from.
Thank you.
Can I just to say that it does sound like there's some really fantastic innovation coming out as part of this webinar across the country, and we, for one, would be very keen to join in a national group looking at some of this, especially to develop the network side, the cluster development going forward as part of the. Really do think some of this stuff is very exciting, and this is just about the right timing for where we are with GP forward view and 5-year forward view at the moment.
Excellent, thank you, Simon. Just one more question, because I'm just conscious we're coming to a close now, but something that came in, so Tanya gave us the example of West Cheshire CCG, and we've had a question, a follow-up question saying, how are CCGs contracting at cluster level, as they are not legal entities? We, the CCG example, are using a memorandum of understanding model, and I wonder if there are better approaches. So does anything come through?
Well, we as part of our cluster work, as part of the foundation, rightly, we put in place for our localities an MOU approach. But we've gone one stage further. Certainly one locality, I can see that going across the piece as well. We've got one locality that formed a separate company and entity that has then been part of an overarching federation that we now have in Buckinghamshire, and that's now the legal entity that will engage in county projects. And we see that those entities perhaps being at a lower level as well. But I agree, it's a challenge from the question.
Potentially some national support on some of that would be helpful.
So I think one of the things that we've been trying to do is put together sort of template agreements.
Yeah.
So whether that be an MOU or going slightly further into an alliance style agreement. One of the things we've been doing with the ICS sites is asking for their examples and sort of collating best practice on that. So I think that we'll see if we can share some of that. But the MOU approach is, I think, the most common at the moment. I think there's a few places going beyond that, and a very few places, like in Tower Hamlets, where you do see legal entities operating at the network level.
Thank you. We've had two more points come in and examples. What I would say is please do keep sending them, because what we'll do is we'll save all the things that have come up in the chat discussion and share them with NHS England colleagues for any follow-up, but also the examples are so useful in terms of the work of the review team. If there's anything else you want to share with either NHSCC or the NHS England team, there's an email address that we could share.
We'll share our review address.
Excellent. So what we'll do is, for those of you that have joined, we'll send the slides out and some contact emails as well following this. You can either get in touch with the NHS England team or the NHSCC team directly. Thank you very much for your time today. It's tough we haven't got more time for questions, but please do submit anything else you want to through the chat facility. All right. Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers as well today.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.